Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to January 2022 and the first seminar series of the Bulkley Valley Research Center for this year. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm hosting today from the traditional territory of the Gitumden clan of the Wet'suwet'en Nation. We're really pleased to have Jaime Pinzon presenting today from Natural Resources Canada, Forest Service Division. And just a little bit to get started about the Research Center. Some of you are new to our seminar series. We've been in operation in the Bulkley Valley in northern BC for 20 years, supporting natural resource research and monitoring to enable citizens and community groups and industry and government to make as informed decisions around management and monitoring as possible, and having decisions made within our local region by people who know the region. We have a great website if you're interested, bvcenter.ca, and if you're not a member and you would like to become a member, please do consider that, and you'll find those links as well on the Research Center website. I'd like to acknowledge a few of our funders. We're supported by the Bulkley Valley Credit Union, the Bulkley Valley Community Foundation, and Wet'suwet'en Community Forest, and it's their support in part that enables us to host these seminars. A little bit about our presenter today. Thanks so much, Jaime, for taking some time. He's a research scientist in biodiversity and ecological restoration with the Department of Natural Resources Canada, Canadian Forest Service. He's located in Edmonton at the Northern Forestry Centre. He's involved with their cumulative effects and sustainable forest management programs, with his research focus being on spider ecology and biodiversity responses to natural and human disturbances. And this presentation is going to take a general overview of some important properties of ecological communities that are key for understanding the management of biodiversity, particularly around forest disturbance, and then look at the concept of ecosystem memory in the context of forest management. Welcome to the Research Center, Jaime, and thanks very much. It's great to have you join us.
Thank you very much, Dawn, and thanks for the introduction. And thank you as well to Adriana, who invited me to present to you. So good afternoon, everyone. Happy New Year. And it's quite a pleasure for me to be here today, even though I'm pretty far from Smithers. Technology allows us to be a little bit close. So thanks all of you to join us today. And I hope you find interesting the presentation I'm about to give. So I'm going to be talking about ecosystem memory, which is a very interesting concept that can be used for conservation and management purposes. And I hope by the end of the seminar, if you are not very familiar with the concept, you will have a fairly good grasp of it. But before getting into the details of ecosystem memory, I just want to touch bases on some more general community properties that build up on this idea of ecosystem memory. So before, I just want to acknowledge these two folks that you see on my screen, Colin Bergeron and John Spence. A lot of the stuff that I will present today is a result of many years of collaboration with both of them, and countless hours of discussion over beers and so on and so forth, that resulted in some of the things that I'm going to show you here. Probably some of you have interacted with Colin. He's a conservation research officer in Revelstoke currently, so you may have interacted with him. Okay, so when you look at the Boreal forest, here I'm just showing two pictures of two different stands, right? So right away, you can see that there are some striking differences between these two particular sites. So on the left-hand side, you see a conifer-dominated stand. On the right-hand side, you see a deciduous-dominated, aspen-dominated stand. So there, besides the tree composition, you start seeing that there are some very interesting differences in forest structure and habitat availability of either stand. You can see that, for example, the understory in the conifer site is very open, whereas the understory in the deciduous site is quite close, and that has an influence on um, uh, environmental conditions, influence on microhabitats, and therefore will have an influence on what species, besides the trees that you see there, what species can survive in each of these stands, whether they are plants or they are mammals, birds, invertebrates, you name it. Now, if we zoom out a little bit and see things from a less site-specific point of view, we can see that these stands, of course, are part of a landscape, right? And like on the top, you see an area where it's mostly conifer, which is at the very top of that picture, whereas you have a younger deciduous stand in between, and then kind of like a mixed patch of deciduous and conifer at the bottom, which is kind of displayed on the lower picture, where you can see that kind of mixture of species. So now we can start thinking about these forest structure and habitat conditions that can change from one scale to another, from a very local scale to a broader scale at the stand level. Now, if we zoom this out a little bit more, we will start thinking about how these stands interact between each other in relation to space, right? Of course, much of what we see today, and not only in the boreal forest, but pretty much everywhere where there is forest, the forest that you see is a product of the disturbances that have happened in the past in those landscapes, right? So in context of the boreal forest, we know that wildfire and insect outbreaks are very prevalent disturbances that in most cases are stand replacement disturbances. So they have a very important role into changing what you see on the landscape through time. So on the picture on the left, we can see an area by Peace River Valley that had been hit by a forest tent caterpillar. And on the right hand, you see a remnants of a wildfire. Now we can start thinking about overlaying these natural disturbances that are driving the boreal forest. We can start putting on top of that human disturbances like forest harvesting or oil and gas exploration and extraction. So now we are dealing with landscapes where we have multiple disturbances occurring on the same area at different times, or sometimes at the same time. And of course, all these will have eventually an influence on how species distribute over the landscape and how species maintain their populations over that same landscape. So we end up with landscapes like this one. So this is an aerial picture that I took close to Peace River, like 40 kilometers northwest of Peace River, where you can see a combination of different disturbances. Of course, here you don't see much of natural disturbances, so there's no a real fire happening in there, right? But what you see on the landscape are results of fire that had happened in the recent and far past, in addition to more recent disturbances associated to forest harvesting, for example, or road construction, seismic lines for oil and gas exploration, and so on and so forth. So now we are dealing with very complex landscapes where these multiple disturbances overlap and interact with each other. So one of the big questions we have in the context of forest management is if it's possible to use those post-disturbance patterns to manage the forest, right? And by talking about management is more in the context of, can we use those patterns to maintain biodiversity and preserve natural communities on those landscapes, allowing those landscapes to recover better and maybe faster following a disturbance. So in this case, particular case, I'm showing on the top a picture of a wildfire, and on the bottom a picture of relatively recent clear harvested area, where um, the forest industry are trying to imitate those patterns left after fire in their cut blocks to better maintain some of the characteristics and structure um, left on that landscape that eventually will allow to maintain species on that landscape and hopefully allow those areas to recover faster. So before I go on, I want to talk a little bit about spatial and temporal structure and therefore succession, which are very important properties of natural communities, which deal with this idea of change, forest change over time and over space, because this is very important in terms of understanding how we can manage our forests and how we can maintain those characteristics that are so important to many of us, both from an ecological and social point of view. So when we think about spatial structure, of course, is the way species are distributed relative to each other, right? So not all species are static. They move across the landscape, but for those that don't move, like plants, their distribution still is determined by many factors that had happened on the landscape. So here I'm just showing you an example of a research site that we have fairly close to Edmonton, where we would have a 1 hectare plot in which we have mapped every single stem above 1 centimeter DBH within that plot. And here I just show you the distribution of the different tree and tall shrub species across that plot. So the green dots are live trees or live stems, and the brown dots are dead stems. So right away you can see that different distributions, even within this very small scale of the different species. Some species like white spruce or birches are widely distributed throughout the plot, whereas there are other species that have much more discrete distribution, particularly larch, where you can see there's a very, very tiny pocket of larch in there. And then you can start asking yourself, well, why larch is occurring only on this part of the plot and not anywhere else? Or the same question can be asked for other species. And of course, this has to do with the biology of the species and the habitat conditions at those specific locations. So this is the same plot, just looking at the pictures of each of those little squares that you see in this slide. So these just canopy pictures of that same plot. And you can start seeing some variation in the canopy composition and the canopy structure across that 1 hectare plot, right? It's a very small area. It's 100 by 100 meter area, but still you can see some very evident changes in how the species distribute throughout that area. Now switching gears a little bit into the idea of temporal structure, again, it's the timing of the appearance and activity of a species. So as Don mentioned in the introduction, I work with spiders, so I'm going to probably show a lot of spider-related research in here. So this is the temporal change of 3 different spider species on that permanent plot that I showed you in the previous slide. And these are data that were collected from May to September. So it's a fairly short window of time, but even then you can see that there are some very interesting changes in the abundance of some of these species. So for example, the first species over there, Pardosa mackensiana, which is a wolf spider, it's more or less prevalent across the whole summer. Whereas the 2 other species, the Alomehea denticetis, which is a sheet weaving spider, and Trochosa terricola, which is another wolf spider, they switch. So the first one appears only at the end of the summer, whereas the first one is more prevalent only at the start of the beginning of the spring. So this is kind of like showing that even at short temporal scales, there are changes in species composition at a given site. Now, if we start thinking about more like a longer terms in time, again, this is based on some results from the EMEND project. For those who are not familiar with the project, it stands for Ecosystem-Based Management Emulating Natural Disturbances, and which I will talk about a little bit further later. So here, basically, we are looking at changes in species richness after different numbered years before harvesting and following harvest. And you can see that, for example, for spiders, over time, the species richness has been increasing, whereas for carabid beetles, species richness has increased, but then it tended to decrease. So there are also changes at these more longer period of time, which are mediated by changes in the ecosystem. So these bring us to the idea of succession and disturbance, and of course change, right? So it's quite widely known, these very overly simplistic view of succession in the boreal forest, where we have a wildfire, and shortly after the wildfire, you have aspen suckering. So you start building up these deciduous dominated stands, which with time will start regenerating some of the spruce in the understory. And eventually, if enough time passes, these spruces grow to the canopy, where you start seeing these mixtures of species in older stands. And as time goes by, much of the aspen or the poplars in general start to die off, resulting in a conifer-dominated stand. Of course, there are variations to this pathway. This is an oversimplistic view, but normally this is what you would see in much of the boreal forest. So as you think about a given site changing over time from a very open area to a deciduous, then to a mixed, and then to a conifer, you would expect that the species compositions, not only of trees, but everything else that lives in those areas, will start shifting as well over time. So, of course, the succession in the boreal is mostly driven by fire, right? And the probability of fire will increase with time, right? So young stands normally don't burn as often as older stands, and it's just basically a function of fuel. So older stands normally have a lot of coarse woody debris and fuel that allow these stands to burn. So this is where this very simplistic successional pathway comes from, where you have these pioneering communities moving slowly over time until you get into these spruce-dominated stands. And of course, wildfire can reset the system at any point of the succession, with older stands being more prone to burn. So when we think about these different cover types, we can start thinking about how species composition changes over time depending on these cover types. So here I'm showing an ordination plot. So for those who are not very familiar with these, each point in there represents a site, and the two sites that are close to each other means that the species composition of those two sites is similar, whereas two sites that are far apart from each other means that the species compositions are very different. Now, if we overlay the cover type in this plot, you can see in a very simple way that the species composition in this case for spiders is very distinct depending whether you have a deciduous dominated or a conifer or a mixed forest type, right? So as the forest changes, the species composition for spiders changes as well. And you will say, well, that's probably spiders, but in reality, this happens to many other groups. So we have evidence for other taxa, which also show differences over time in composition. And those differences are driven by the successional stage of the forest. For some species is more clear than others, but normally you would expect to find distinctive communities depending on the age or the cover type of a given stand. So when we put all these together, we can start thinking about what we see today is the result of what has happened in the past, right? So the history of a landscape is very important because it will determine largely what you see today, right? So there's of course a climate that has a big influence on changes that happen on that landscape that will of course influence how stands distribute throughout space and how species interact and disperse throughout that landscape. And of course, will determine the productivity at the site level. So all these interactions, of course, will have a direct or indirect influence on the composition and diversity of a given community at a given point in time. So of course, we have these primary factors that determine biodiversity at the site, which relate to physical properties. For example, climate and the environment itself. And there are some other secondary factors that build up on top of the physical factors, right? So now we have very complex interactions in there that will eventually have that influence on the composition of species that you see in the present at a given site. And this is what I am talking about, ecological memory. All that information that is contained on a landscape, whether it's at the local or at the broad scale, is going to determine and influence the species compositions that you see in the present, and eventually will have that same influence in the future. So when we think about ecological memory or ecosystem memory, is basically the extent to which an ecosystem is affected by its past, right? So it's built upon the idea of all those legacies that remained after a disturbance. So that information that is retained on those legacies is carried into the future and will have a lesser or greater influence on the recovery of a post-disturbance ecosystem. So we can have internal or external memory, depending on whether those legacies persist within or outside the disturbed area. And most of these legacies relate to the organisms and the structure that is left after a disturbance. So of course, these legacies will have a direct influence on the resilience and the regeneration of an ecosystem, and ultimately will determine the structure, composition, and function of those post-disturbance communities, right? So normally, depending on the severity and the type of disturbances of the disturbance, those lasting effects and the quality of those legacies may change, right? It's different a legacy that is retained after a wildfire than a legacy that is retained after blowdown or insect outbreaks. So we are starting to build up a little bit into this concept of ecological memory, and thinking that what the landscapes that we see today, of course, they are product of natural disturbance, right? In the far past, much of what we see today has been influenced by those natural disturbances that occurred in the past, right? And these areas that got disturbed, let's say by wildfire, eventually recovered over time. And now we are placing on top of those areas additional human disturbances, right, that are also recovering over time. So here we see a natural recovery and a recovery influenced by the specific footprint associated to the human disturbance that we are placing on that landscape. So of course, what you see at a given location will eventually be a response and a result of the type of disturbance that had happened in the past and how these areas have been recovered either naturally or by some ways of human intervention over time. So this is what ecosystem memory is about. How much information from the past we can bring into the present and into the future that can be used to helping those landscapes to recover in a better way and in probably faster as well. So this is where the EMEND experiment comes into the play. So the EMEND experiment started back in the late 90s, where there was a big paradigm shift into how forestry was being done. And the idea was trying to emulate patterns left by wildfire into the harvesting operations so that these structures were left on the landscape and similar to those from wildfire, hoping that those structures will help the recovery process of the harvested areas much faster. So this project was set out to test the hypothesis that retention harvesting was more efficient and more ecologically meaningful way of resource extraction than the then traditional clear cutting approach. So here, the map that I show you is, of course, the location of the project. So this is close to Peace River in Alberta. And this aerial view, you see a bunch of colored polygons. These are about 10-hectare compartments that have been treated to different retention levels, ranging from pure clear cuts to different amount of tree retention left after harvesting, and some areas that were left untouched as controls. So now we have different intensities of harvesting, and this is a very interesting setting to testing this idea of the ecosystem memory. So now we have forest, the idea of forest succession, but now we are applying harvesting on those landscapes at different stand types, depending on the specific industry requirements. Some of them harvest softwoods, some of them harvest hardwoods. So there will be a target for specific stands. And of course, this is going to alter somewhat, and in many cases, largely, that ideal succession pathway on a given landscape, right? So what we are very interested in is understanding the interaction between these natural disturbances and these human disturbances, and how that interaction influences the species composition at a given site at a given period of time. So from the EMEND perspective, here I just put the different cover types there, just kind of like to give you an idea of where in the successional pathway these stands sit on, because I will be talking a little, quite a bit about these different 4 cover types in the remaining of the talk. So when we start looking at some of the results from the EMEND project, so we have here, I'm showing you 4 panels, each for each of those cover types. And I'm showing the recruitment, the deciduous recruitment. So basically aspen suckering in stems per hectare for the different treatments on the x-axis. So the R's is the retention. So R0 is 0 retention, R10 is 10% retention, 20% retention, 50% retention, 75% retention, and the control. So of course, it's quite expected that recruitment will change depending on the amount of retention left on the landscape. But what I'm most interested in showing here is that the amount of recruitment depends on the previous forest cover type on that area. So as you can see, areas that were a deciduous dominated stand before the harvesting application occurred, they are recovering, and the recruitment is largely aspen, like compared to conifer sites, where of course we see some aspen suckering, but it's in a much lesser degree. So just by doing harvesting and leaving the system to regenerate, you can see right away the impact of the previous cover type on the, in this case, the deciduous recruit. So one of the main things that we were very interested in, it was trying to reconstruct the history of the EMEND landscape. Was a big component of Colin Bergeron's PhD project, where he set out this fairly large and extensive grid of points across the EMEND landscape. And this is not small feet, like we're talking about a 7 by 10, 12 kilometer landscape. And he went across that grid and cut trees down and got cookies back, and in hopes that he would be able to reconstruct the fire history of that landscape, which he actually did. So from his work, he was able to identify different number of fire events on that landscape, and especially those 3 events that I show there in red, which are the ones that had the greatest influence on originating the stands that are part of the project. So when we think about this landscape and the fire history, of course, there are cohorts that have survived different fires at different times. And then you can see on the landscape some overlapping areas. So for example, the 1895 fire, most of the trees encircled by these red areas were trees that survived 1895 fire. And if we start going back in time, the 1877 fire, there are some areas where there are trees that had survived that fire, and so on for 1837. This is a very noodle kind of twisted picture, which I am not expecting you to fully grasp. But what I'm trying to show here is that there are areas that had been hit by different fires at different times, and there are trees that had survived over and over these different fire events. So there's this idea of mixed severity fire regime on the landscape, where you have fires occurring at different times that are influencing shortly after and long after the distribution and the composition of, in this case, the trees, and therefore the many other communities that live in these landscapes. So when we start thinking about that fire history, the fire origin of the forest types at EMEND link very nicely with the forest type that were present at the time of the experiment start. So we see that these areas in blue are areas that originated from the 1895 fire, and the areas in green are areas that originated from the 1837 fire, which correspond to respectively younger stands, which are the yellow and orange stands, which are deciduous and deciduous spruce understory, and older areas, which are shown here in red and green, which are basically the mixes and the conifers. So there's a very nice relationship between that fire origin and the current cover type across that landscape. So now we can start linking that fire history to the actual experimental units on the EMEND landscape. And when these different stands originated from, to have an idea of the impact of past, right, of the past on the present species compositions. So the main question that we had is if we could use the fire history as a predictor of the pre-harvest tree species basal area. So we are moving back 20 years. So this is the landscape in 1999 before the harvesting prescriptions were applied on that landscape. And we are trying to see if whatever was on that landscape in 1999 could be explained from the fire history that Colin reconstructed based on the cookies. And actually, we were able to see a very tight relationship between what was on that landscape in 1999 with the actual fire history on that landscape. So with that, we have filled a piece of the puzzle, but now what we were now interested is if we could use that pre-harvest tree information as a predictor of the pre-harvest species assemblages. So here we are still in 1999, where no harvesting has occurred. And as I showed you earlier, we were expecting that depending on the forest cover type, there would be different species assemblages. And in fact, that's what I am showing here, is that we were able to predict the species composition, in this case of spiders and carabid beetles, in 1999 with the pre-harvest tree data. So there's a very tight relationship between forest cover type and these two assemblages of invertebrates. So now we have another piece of the puzzle. So the main question is that, okay, now we know that we can predict fire history using the tree species composition, which is more readily available than the actual fire history. And we know that the tree species composition has an influence on the composition of other assemblages, right? So now the big question is how we can use this information to determine how much both of the pre-harvest and the post-harvest effects influence the current species composition. So this is kind of like looking at that accumulation of disturbances and how that combination, that cumulative effect of disturbances determine what we see today in the present. So just to conceptualize this, let's imagine that the current species assemblage is depicted by this blue rectangle. So that's the total variation in composition. And we know that part of that variation of the current species assemblage is a function of the past, so the pre-harvest conditions, and the more recent past, the post-harvest conditions. So part of that variation is going to be explained by the fire history, and some of it is going to be explained by the effects imposed by harvest. So if we add these together, we'll have an explanation of variation by these two sources of disturbance, which we expect that they are going to have some degree of interaction, right? Because anyways, we are looking at a continuum of time. Therefore, whatever the harvest did on that landscape would influence whatever fire did on that same landscape. So just to conceptualize to move this from this very conceptual framework into something that we can actually measure, we can produce this variation and estimate it as a percentage of variation of the total variation of the current assemblage as a function of the pre-harvest and the post-harvest condition. And we can also measure the interaction between the two and translate this as a bar plot. So here we will be able to know or to see what is the contribution of each of these components to the present species composition. And this is precisely what I show you on this slide. So here I have three sets of bars at three different periods of time through the EMEND recent history, right? So this is 2 years following harvesting, 5 years following harvesting, and 10 years following harvesting. And again, the green parts relate to the variation explained by the fire history. The pink areas is the post-harvest variation, and the gray areas are the interaction. So as you can see, at least for spiders, the current composition of spiders on that landscape is largely determined by the post-harvest influence, which is the pink area, but nonetheless, the green area, which is the pre-harvest, has quite an important influence as well, particularly over time. So if you were to look right following after harvesting, the pre-harvest condition has a very little contribution to the present explanation of the species assemblages at that time. But, and then you would conclude, well, most of what is explaining the composition of those species at that given time is based on the harvesting disturbance. However, if you let that landscape move into the future, so now we move into the 5 or 10 years after, we start seeing that that pre-harvest information is starting to become more and more important in contributing to the actual species composition that you see on that landscape. So basically, we are seeing that this memory is somewhat retained on that landscape and is becoming more and more important to determine what species you find on that landscape. So basically, we can think about this as early after harvesting, we have a large ecological amnesia, and that memory is perhaps improving over time. When we start looking at other assemblages, for example, for beetles, for carabid beetles, we kind of see a very different pattern in which that past is quite prevalent over time, but tends to be lost later on. So we have a large ecological memory early on, and some of it is lost over time. So there's some memory loss in there. Whereas for songbirds, all the fractions remain relatively similar until 10 years, where that interaction starts to become very important. This happens to other taxa as well. So we are looking at tree recruitment, we are looking at shrubs, we are looking at herbs, we are looking at bryophytes, and we can see that depending on the group that you are looking at, the influence of that memory is changing depending on those taxa, right? So this kind of gives us this very interesting idea on the impacts of disturbances in general, whether they are natural or anthropogenic, into shaping natural communities in the present. And what you see today is essentially a function and a result of this accumulation of disturbances and information on the landscape. So of course, the spatial and temporal structure and the composition of species, it is a result of those interactions between species and the type and quality of the legacies that are left after a disturbance, and therefore the influence of those patterns, those recovery patterns from disturbances. Not only the most recent disturbance, but also disturbances that happened in the far past, like as I showed you before, where we see that fire history plays a very important role in explaining the composition of species even after harvest. So one of the main drawbacks here is that, of course, human and natural disturbances are not analogous. So there are many gaps that we cannot fill with this type of information, but at least by emulating these patterns of natural disturbances, we are retaining some of those legacies that will carry some of that ecological memory into the landscape, that we expect that information will be determinant for aiding into the recovery process of the forest, right? However, the most important thing is understanding the underlying process of those patterns, right? And that's probably one of the main questions that remain unanswered. So in conclusion here, we can see that ecological memory is a very important feature that is seldom taken into account when you are understanding species distributions and the influence of disturbances on the landscape. And something that is very important is that this memory and the post-harvest persistence of those legacies is taxon dependent. So when you are managing a forest using only plants, probably you are missing a big chunk of the information that is carried by other communities, right? And maybe you are managing a forest just by looking partially to the whole system, right? So there are very important cumulative effects of these disturbances, that need to be taken into account when you are trying to manage a forest or a given site, because they have very important implications for the conservation of biodiversity and particularly for restoring ecosystems, right? So I just want to finish with this little statement here, um, and I'm just going to read it. Biodiversity conservation goals should not depend exclusively on how we manage our forests today and in the future, but also on knowing about their past. And this comes back to this idea of ecological memory, in which the past has a very important influence on what we see today in the present. So thank you very much for your attendance, and I hope that you have found this interesting, and I hope that there is some time left for questions. I see there's a little bit of time there, so I'll be more than happy to take any questions if any. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jaime.